This morning I just want to take a couple minutes. Just want to ask you a simple question that's a rhetorical question, but do you believe God? That's not really a question for all of us here. We all do, otherwise none of us would be here, right? But as time goes along, have you ever found yourself becoming a little bit of a cynic? Because as we all understand, our salvation is not ours. Only God can do that. There's nothing that we can do or boast about that. It's a God thing. But when it comes to faith, there's certain things that you and I need to do to help make that happen. So Romans chapter 4, Paul writes this, "Against all hope, Abraham in hope believed, and so became the father of many nations, just as it had been said to him, so shall your offspring be." Without weakening in his face, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had the power to do what he had promised. That is why it was credited to him as righteousness. All of us know the story, right? There's nothing, no surprises there. But when God promised Abraham that he and Sarah would have a son, Abraham had to face facts that when the promise came, he was in his 70s. Now the promise that had come before, and you go back to Genesis 12, well, it was God would bless the whole world through him and all that. And how many kids did he have? And he promised him that his offspring would be as numerous as the stars, sand on the seashore, all of the above. God was going to promise all that. But all of a sudden now, the years go by and what? Nothing's happened. Nothing has happened. So let me ask you again, do you believe God? Oh, of course, yeah. Do you believe he's going to do what he promised? Do you really believe he's going to do what he promised? That he's going to fulfill the promises that he made to you personally? I trust you do, but there's four things I want to look at quickly this morning. First one is you got to face the facts. Abraham faced the fact that his body was as good as dead, and that Sarah as well. Because at the time the last visitation came, Abraham was 99. You know any 99-year-olds? Well, Abraham's 99, Sarah's 89, and got to face the facts. It's probably not going to happen. But he didn't let circumstances influence his faith. But Abraham, it says, against all hope, he believed. Well, that's a strange statement. But I do like that because he looked at the circumstances, his body, Sarah's body, through the eyes of faith. Everything on the outward situation said, nah, this isn't going to work. But see, it doesn't really matter what you're believing God for or what you need or what circumstances you're surrounded by right now. What really counts is what God says. And his faith wasn't weak. Second thing he did was he didn't waver. If you go back and read the story in Genesis 18, do you remember when the angel of the Lord, or Jesus, however you want to translate that, came and visited them? When Sarah heard the news, what did she do? Do you remember? She started cracking up, laughing. Well, come on. So she did the natural response, and yet Abraham didn't say anything because he didn't waver. James talks about that when he says, "But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like the wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord." I know people come back, they feel God spoke to them, they heard something, they're high, but they make all the right confessions, they read all the right scriptures, but as time goes by and there's no answer, their faith begins to waver. Because, well, where's God? It's only been a week. How come he hasn't done anything? Or it's been a year. Or it's been 5 years. Or it's been 20 years, and it hasn't happened yet. See, the enemy always tries to get us to focus on our circumstances instead of on what God said. And it's the same thing he did with Adam and Eve. He kept saying, did God really, maybe you misunderstood. And his tactics haven't changed. Now, that doesn't mean that the circumstances don't exist. We have to be realists, right? I look at it, know exactly, oh, this is the way it is. But we don't deny that situation, but we see it through the eyes of faith. And said, it's obviously not looking like it's going to happen, but God said he would do it. Third thing he did is gave God the glory. He didn't waver through unbelief regarding God's promise, but was strengthened in his faith, and he gave glory to God. Interesting word. Give glory to God. He gave him all the credit and blessed him even before it happened. There was no evidence of anything yet, and it lines up with everything that we're taught in the New Testament, because you have to believe God and thank him for the answer when you pray. How many, I think just about all of us here are parents, and you have kids come and they ask and ask and ask and ask and ask and ask and ask. After a while you get tired of asking, don't you? And you just go sit down and you'll get it at the right time, but especially when they start nagging, that really gets a lot for it. But when they come and say thank you, like little girls do, and manipulate grandpa like crazy, they get just about anything they want. Right? There's something about Thanksgiving that touches a whole different gear, doesn't it, when they come that way? Paul writes this, don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. You can't afford to wait till you get the answer to start giving thanks. You need to start doing it right after and right along with when you ask for it. So do it right away. Whatever it is that you're facing, or whatever the answer is that you're looking for, you start giving thanks now. And lastly, you got to be fully persuaded. Strong in the faith, so he didn't dwell just on the circumstances, didn't waver on God's promises through unbelief. Why? Because he was fully persuaded. Our job, as I see it, or what comes to our faith, is you got to face the facts. You got to see, what circumstances are. You're not here to deny any of that. You don't waver. You give glory to God, and then you're fully persuaded that he's going to do that. That's our side. God's responsibility is to act and to fulfill his promise. Sad thing is we tend to lose our focus, we tend to waver, and we focus on circumstances rather than on what God said. Interesting thing happened to Paul. He was traveling, he's a prisoner, he's taken to Rome, and apparently the captain of the ship does not make the right choice. They sail at the wrong time. They hit a horrible storm. The ship is breaking up. They've thrown everything. All the cargo's off. They're tying ropes. I don't know how you tie ropes around the boats back then, but anyway, they did, trying to hold it together so it wouldn't fall apart through the storm. Then finally, they're all desperate. These are seasoned sailors. So Paul goes to pray, and here's what he says when they're in the midst of the storm and everything's going crazy and the ship's about to fall apart. He says, last night an angel of the God whom I serve. And he stood beside me and said, don't be afraid, Paul, you must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Now, we've seen the ferries that have tipped over, different shipwrecks, stuff like that's on the news on a regular basis. And there's always casualties. Nobody died on this one. They didn't have all the modern conveniences that we have today to help save people's lives. But yet that happened because Paul had faith, and Paul asked God for everybody's life on the ship. And yet God did exactly what he asked for. So what is it that you're facing? Do you believe God? Let me come back to my original question. Abraham was fully persuaded. Are you? Paul said that God is able to do immeasurably more all that we could ask or imagine. I can imagine quite a bit. God's more than able to do all that.